I wanted to start out this video with a warning for anyone who is easily offended by pretty much anything. This comic contains a lot of gore, violence, sex, drug use, sexual abuse, physical abuse, animal death, racist terminology, sacrilegious words and images, and just about anything else you can think of that someone might take offense to. If there's anything in there you don't want to see, go ahead and close this video now. Everyone else, feel free to stick around. Hello and welcome to The Comic Cave. I'm Ramsey, aka Captain Away, and today I'm looking at the 1995 to 2000 series, Preacher. At its most basic, Preacher is a pretty simple comic. It's the story of these three sort of friends on an epic road trip across America to find God and get some answers about life, the universe, and everything. It's just that those three people happen to be a vampire, a hitwoman, and a preacher who accidentally killed his entire congregation when he was endowed with heavenly superpowers. The God they're looking for is quite literal, and the answers are for the questions of why does he suck so much and how could he let the earth get so bad. In just about any other comic, these three despicable people would probably be villains, but the 90s was the decade of the anti-hero, so instead this comic depicts them as being some of the least bad people in a world ridiculously overpopulated with the absolute worst of human beings. So that means that, along the way, they'll face down just about every vile, disgusting, offensive, disturbing, ridiculous, and degrading thing that writer Garth Ennis and artist Steve Dillon could think to throw at the trio. But while on its surface, it may seem like it's simply a comic attempting to offend as many people as possible, underlying all that sin and grossness is a comic primarily about three people doing their best to live the life they want and attempt to be the best people they can be, all while trying to understand their place in a universe gone mad. That makes this comic seem surprisingly heartfelt, sincere, and much more relatable than you might expect. And that's why it's probably a comic worth talking about. So let me do just that as I take this away. The comic opens with some hot angel on demon sexy times. Okay, actually, it opens with our three main characters, Princess Cassidy, Tulip O'Hare, and Jesse Custer, sitting in a diner talking over their recent history. But that framing story is actually completely pointless and didn't last past the first story arc, so meh. This story is so long, there's no way I could cover it going through the plot like I normally do, so instead I'm going to talk a bit about the characters, starting with that shitty band, Genesis. Oh wait, no, I mean the disembodied baby face thing, Genesis. And his story starts with some very illicit angel-demon sex. Because Daddy Angel impregnated Mommy Demon, and that created something completely new to the universe, a baby with the power to rival God's own. The birth of Genesis immediately led to three important events. First was the death of the mother, the second was the father being cast out of heaven, and the third was the Lord God himself going on walkabout the moment the baby was born, abandoning both heaven and earth. The angels of heaven attempt to lock away the baby, but heaven cannot handle all that power, so it breaks free, leading us to this pretty iconic shot as these angels stare at the spot it broke out and discuss how completely screwed they are. Genesis doesn't last long on its own though, apparently preferring to trade one cage for another, and enters into the body of the small-town preacher Jesse Custer. This event causes a massive explosion that kills all of the town of Anvil, the major event that kicks off this entire series and brings pretty much all of our characters together. We'll get to that, and Jesse, later though. First, let's take a look at Tulip O'Hare. Oh wait, no, this is Tulip. Hard to tell a difference, I know. Also not to be confused with dark-haired Tulip, one-eyed Tulip, other one-eyed Tulip, and glasses Tulip. I mean seriously, look at this. That's the same person, right? Not that the males are much better. You see about the same 3 or so males used over and over again as minor or background characters. I don't think this was intentional, just a result of Steve Dillon's style. Anyway, Tulip was born to a super conservative father who never even considered the possibility of having anything but a son. But while he was celebrating with buddies in a bar, his wife died in childbirth and his son turned out to be a daughter. He decided he could still raise her as a boy, and certainly to his credit, he may be a crazy gun-obsessed conservative, but he at least is a good father. Look at him encouraging her with her little gun. Aww, what a sweet dad. His character arc is probably the best of the whole series, as raising his daughter gets him all bent out of shape over protecting women's rights, to the great confusion of his friends. And his defense of Tulip's beating the crap out of a school bully with a baseball bat is a pretty great moment. Unfortunately, he meets an untimely end in a tragic hunting accident, which gets Tulip to swear off guns. Eventually, Tulip runs across Jesse in a bar and falls for him instantly. She steals him from his current girlfriend, and the two begin a Bonnie and Clyde life of crime and sex. That is, until the day Jesse completely vanishes on her, stranding her in Phoenix, Arizona. She's forced to take on some unseemly employment until eventually she becomes a hitwoman for this scuzzy wannabe crime lord. But her first job, which gets a gun back in her hands for the first time since that hunting trip, doesn't go well, leaving her running from her intended target and hopping into the car of our next character, the vampire Cassidy. Cassidy was born in Ireland around the turn of the century, the 20th century that is, and is probably here for Irish-born Ennis to be able to give observations from a perspective he is actually familiar with. Cassidy and his brother were involved in the Easter Rebellion of 1916, but brother Bill pulled Cassidy out of the fire before that went, as the British might say, all tits up. But as Bill tried to drag his younger brother home, they were suddenly ambushed by a random old vampire lady living in a river. She bit Cass, but before she could kill him, Bill gets a headshot on her, and the two fall into the river. When Cass emerges the next day, he immediately catches on fire and quickly learns to stay out of the sun. He travels to America and spends most of the 1900s traveling around the states, interacting Forrest Gump-like with history, until one day he finds himself in Dallas, being carjacked by a crazy lady with a gun. Tulip never played GTA though, so she doesn't know she's just supposed to open the door and pull him out, and instead the two are quickly running from her failed hit. That brings them near Anvil when the Genesis bomb goes off, bringing them together with Jesse. Tulip's time in the comic is spent largely being protected by the two male characters, despite the fact that she overcomes her hatred of guns and recalls all her training to become a pretty capable character who kicks some serious ass throughout the series. There's even a scene where she gets her hands on a car-mounted minigun and single-handedly fights off an entire army with it. But despite that, Jesse still leaves her behind not once, but 2 more times when he knows there's going to be danger, because he's an asshole. Cassidy spends a lot of the comic proving himself to be quite an asshole himself. All he really cares about is partying, drugs, and alcohol. Though he does attempt to save Jesse's life at one point, he's revealed to be hanging out with the other two mostly due to the fact that he's fallen pretty hard for Tulip, and hits on her several times throughout the series, despite the fact that she's with Jesse again. At one point, when he and Tulip believe Jesse to be dead, he even keeps her drunk and drugged, until she loses enough inhibitions to sleep with him. Pretty messed up. We also have Sheriff Hugo Root, who is a pretty minor character, but the first to try and hunt down Jesse. Hugo is the utter epitome of white racist crazy conspiracy nut. His explanation for the church explosion is so bizarre, I don't know whether I should laugh or be horribly offended, and honestly that's probably the exact reaction Ennis was going for. Root doesn't last long because Jesse uses the word on him in a very messed up way, and he's forced to obey as literally as he can. And after experiencing that, he just takes his own gun and kills himself. It's pretty messed up, especially since he gets his son to get him the gun first. But that leaves his son, Eugene Root, whom this comic will quickly take to calling Artspace due to his deformity, which he got when he failed to take his own life using his dad's shotgun. Eugene swears vengeance on Jesse, becoming one of the characters that attempts to hunt him down as the comic goes on. But the first chance he gets, Jesse ends up talking him out of it, and instead he ends up hanging out with Jesse and Cassidy in New Orleans until a band calls him up on a stage to sing a song with them. And he sings... wait, what is that? Oasis? Actually, no, yeah, that somehow makes total sense. Eugene's recruited by a seedy record producer who intentionally spreads vile rumors about the kid as his popularity grows, eventually leading to the rumor that Eugene called up the Pope himself and said vile things to him. This is what, I guess, passes for this comic's sense of humor. Another important character is the Saint of Killers, this giant of a man who looks like he fell straight out of a spaghetti western where someone mashed Lee Marvin, Clint Eastwood, and Jack Palance into a single person. He was a cold-hearted killer in life, except for a brief period where he had a wife and daughter, but they were killed by some sickness, and as we learn, there is apparently some degree of intention in their deaths. The Saint died so angry that he was reborn as the Saint of Killers to do any killing God needed, and has been resting under Boot Hill for the next time he's needed. After Genesis escapes, the angels wake him to send him after Jesse. The Saint spends much of the comic hunting down Jesse, killing anyone who gets in his way, or sometimes just killing anything that's in the area because he can. There's a scene where he literally fills a hallway with corpses. When he learns that Genesis holds the secret to what happened to his family, he agrees to not kill Jesse if Jesse agrees to learn that information and give it to him. But before Jesse can do that, a bomb brings an entire mountain down on him, and when he gets out, he's ready to hunt down the preacher more. Maybe I should explain that. So here's this other character, a German man named Herr Starr. He's basically the primary villain of the comic. Star is part of a secret group within the church called the Grail. The Grail's goal is in preserving the bloodline of Christ. As this comic tells it, Jesus' death on the cross was faked, and after he spent 3 days recovering, he went on to live a full life, even having children. The Grail saw to it that those children bred with each other, and their children too, and so on and so forth for nearly 2,000 years. The Grail did this because they planned to bring about the end of the world in the year 2000, playing on those old apocalyptic prophecies everyone was so worried about at the time. Armageddon would come controlled entirely by the Grail, who would then roll out their Son of God. He would perform miracles, Armageddon would suddenly stop, and the Grail would remake the world in their image. That was the plan anyway, but Star saw the damage inbreeding did to the bloodline and figured, nobody's gonna believe this person as the Messiah. Further, there is the fat, disgusting Allfather of the Grail, who Star clearly took an extreme personal dislike to. So Star, learning of Jesse Custer and his powers, decides he's going to continue the Grail's Armageddon plans, but put Custer as his personal Messiah, and kill the bloodline and the current Allfather in order to take his place. Their first attempt to take Jesse fails when, in order to protect Tulip, Cassidy pretends to be Jesse, and honestly, Cassidy's awful southern accent is probably my favorite part of the whole series. They do a lot of dialogue writing attempting to illustrate a fake southern accent, and it's pretty hilarious. It's also a great metaphor for Ennis' own inability to represent Texas in any believable way whatsoever, but who not from Texas is gonna know, right? It's also fairly showing of the character, especially in light of a later conversation where Cassidy and Jesse discuss this whole ordeal, and Jesse is apparently able to fake a fairly acceptable Irish accent. It really highlights the difference for them in how they view friendship. For Jesse, a friend is someone who's touched through to his soul, and so he pays attention to who they are. For Cassidy, a friend is someone you can party with, and for a 100-year-old vampire, that's a fairly interchangeable part. Star takes Cassidy to the Grail's base in France, a place they call Masada. There's a multiple showdown here between Star, the Allfather, Jesse, and the Saint of Killers that ends with Star setting the self-destruct on the complex in order to kill the Allfather, the Grail's Messiah, and the Saint. Star comes out of this with a great big scar across the top of his bald head that he says makes him look like a penis. I think it looks more like a butt, but I guess they already had a character named Arseface and didn't want to also have one called Butthead. I do enjoy his rather silly attempt at trying different wigs and hats in order to hide the scar, like this Princess Leia wig. Why was that even an option? I kinda like this hat too, but he goes with the Panama Jack instead. Well, hard to hate a fedora. He dedicates the rest of the comic to killing Custer, first by trying to blow him up in the desert with an atomic bomb, and then when even that fails, by deploying the last remaining of the Grail's troops to the Alamo to snipe him down. But that's the end of the comic, and before I get there, let's go ahead and talk about Jesse. Jesse's father, John Custer, was a Marine in the Vietnam War, and the highlight of his tour was the time he met his hero John Wayne, who gave their entire unit little Zippo lighters with some inspiring words of wisdom. Not gonna lie, that's actually pretty funny. When John returns from the war, he's greeted by his future wife in a true hero's welcome. Christina Langell had run away from home and had been spending time with some hippies, and had been a bit taken in with their anti-war slogans. She feels bad about doing this to John, and the two begin talking, and before long, they're making babies. Well, baby. Our main character, Jesse. But the happy days don't last long, as soon these hillbillies that look like they fell out of the Hills Have Eyes show up. Actually, that movie and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series seem like they're probably the primary inspiration for this entire comic series. There's so many similarities. These characters are Jordie and TC, who work for Jesse's grandmother, Christina's mother, Miss Marie Langell. They bring the family back to their home in Angelville, which obviously nobody would confuse with Anvil. Completely different. There they raise Jesse in a horrible existence. Some notable things that happen include Jesse spending entire weeks down at the bottom of a swamp in a coffin as punishment. There's also Jesse's one and only friend, a young boy from a heavily inbred family with Cyclopia, who was going to marry his sister one day. That is, until he slept over one night in a barn and woke the next morning to find TC having sex with a chicken. Yeah, that's something that actually happens in this comic. TC actually has a weird obsession with having sex with pretty much any living thing, and the less normal, the better. When TC discovers Billy Bob in the barn, he thinks he's spying on him and cuts the young boy's throat. At one point, John, Christina, and Jesse all try to run from the place, but they're unsuccessful and Jordie kills John right in front of Jesse. Later, the first time Miss Marie says she is going to put Jesse in the coffin, Christina defies her mother, and Marie decides she's no longer worth keeping around, so when Jordie drags her away, you know what's in store for her. Eventually, Jesse manages to get away from the place, which is when he ran into Tulip. But just as with his mom, his past catches up with him, and TC and Jordie find him and drag him back to Angelville, which is why Jesse abandoned Tulip that first time in Phoenix. There his grandmother forces him to become a preacher, which he does, and that's how he ended up in Anvil. But he's not happy with his new life, and one night he got super drunk and cursed out the whole town in a bar. There he announced everyone's sins, like how the bar owner watered down the beer, or these frat boy types who raped a young girl and got away with it because their papa was rich. The townfolk don't take kindly to this, beating the crap out of the drunk preacher, but for some reason this gets all of them into church the next day, which is unfortunate for them because that's when Genesis finds Custer and the explosion happens. When Jesse wakes up with Genesis inside him, he quickly learns that he's developed a superpower, the ability to command anyone to do anything. They call this the Word of God, and with it at his command, they set off to find God and get some answers from him. The first time they find him is when Jesse and Tulip get dragged back to Angelville by Jordie and TC. It seems God has been spending time in Angelville, telling them about Jesse's new power and making them immune to it. So, to punish Jesse for running away after the Anvil incident, they shoot Tulip in the head. Yeah, she's straight up dead. But then God decides to revive her, telling her it's because he's a loving God and asking her to convince Jesse to stop this ridiculous crusade. Tulip's not buying it though, saying if he's such a loving God, why'd he let her die in the first place? God, purposefully or not, it's never clarified, restores Jesse's powers, and once he realizes it, he takes his revenge on first TC, and then Jordie, while Angelville burns down with Miss Marie inside. Reunited, Tulip and Jesse spend a large span of issues having sex in hotel rooms, until Jesse abandons her to go to France to rescue Cassidy after he's kidnapped by the Grail, which is the second time God shows up. He appears to Cassidy this time, telling him now to convince Jesse to stop looking for him, which isn't any more effective than it was the first time. They next find him in the Nevada desert, after Star tried to blow them all up with a nuke. Jesse, Tulip, and Cassidy tried to escape the Grail's troops in a plane, but Jesse gets thrown out. Cassidy grabs him before he falls, but he orders him to let go. I don't know, man, he's been shown to be a super strong vampire. He might have been able to pull you back in, especially if you ordered him to, but whatever. Always gotta be the big bad cowboy willing to sacrifice himself, I guess. This time, God rescues Jesse, and a third time asks him to stop his quest. Instead, Jesse tries to use the word on him, but God stops him and bites his freaking eye out? What the hell? He's stopped from killing Jesse by the appearance of the Saint, as even God's afraid of the Saint apparently. After this confrontation, Jesse's mind is a little out of sorts. He finds Tulip and Cassidy again, but sees that they've started their messed up one-sided relationship, and it floors him. Literally. Not realizing yet what a danger Cassidy truly is to those around him, Jesse wanders off until he ends up in this little town where he spends much of the second half of the comic. By a weird set of circumstances, he ends up becoming the sheriff of the town and spends his time fighting off the racist, power-hungry owner of the nearby meatpacking plant, Odin Quincannon. Jesse spends a lot of this arc beating up racist and being very anti-racist, earning the respect of his deputy, the one black character in the entire comic. I guess that's not technically true. And while I enjoy seeing racist and Klan members get the crap beat out of them as much as the next guy, it honestly feels pretty disingenuous to me. I mean, Jesse has scoffed at women's rights, has raged in true 90s fashion about how political correctness is liberal BS, but suddenly he's supposedly all super anti-racist? I'm sorry, but I fail to believe that someone so incapable of recognizing the same oppression put on other types of people is really this pissed off about racism. Also in this town is a woman named Jordie, who looks pretty much just like the other Jordie. What? Is no one going to acknowledge that? Oh, okay, she's his mom. Apparently she survived being shot in the head by Jordie, but forgot who she was and went on to open a bar in this small town. That's strangely convenient for all involved. Once Jesse fulfills his big cowboy dreams of running the bad guys out of town, he returns to Tulip and Cassidy, where he finally learns of Cassidy's history of being a destructive and abusive personality. So the two meet up at the Alamo and have a big fist fight. The fight ends with Cassidy sucker punching Jesse after begging for help. Then, while Jesse can't move, he steps into the sunlight and burns away. Star had followed them there, and once Cassidy is gone, he has a sniper shoot Jesse, killing both him and Genesis at once. Tulip also shows up, though Jesse tried to leave her behind again, this time by drugging her. She was woken up by the awesome dog Jesse adopted late in the series. Seriously, that dog is like the best character in the comic. Tulip kills Star, but it's too late to stop him from killing Jesse. But that's still not the end of the comic. Turns out Cassidy made a deal with God where if he set Jesse up to die, then they both would get to live. So Cassidy actually comes back as a human. Tulip, meanwhile, can't forgive Jesse for abandoning her again and tries to leave this pretty one-sided relationship. But Jesse comes chasing after her on horseback through traffic, and that's a move that would definitely work in a romantic comedy, so why not? The comic ends with God returning to heaven only to find the Saint of Killers waiting for him, having already killed his way through all of the angels of heaven. Turns out, Jesse and the Saint had planned for Star to kill Jesse so that Genesis would die, so that God would return to heaven, only to find this exact situation waiting for him. The Saint shows God the same mercy he's shown to everyone else, then sits down and, dies too, I guess? Yeah, Saint, I need a rest too, so let's get to the breakdown. This comic reeks of an author raging at a world he hasn't really lived in. There's so many attempts to make light of people trying to deal with serious issues or oversimplify their motivations that makes it feel like Ennis just hasn't ever spent time around anyone who felt strongly about anything. Also, if this comic has taught me anything, it's that Ennis and Dylan have never been to Texas. Like this. This is supposed to be an hour outside of Houston. I grew up an hour outside of Houston. It's all woods, grasslands, swamps, and heavily urbanized suburban areas. This is a gas station in a desert. That's not Texas. Or there's the bad attempts at dialogue, like when he uses fixin' to here. Yes, Texans say fixin' to. Good job knowing that much at least. But it means immediately. As in, you have 1 minute because I'm fixing to get in my truck and drive down to the Astrodome for the rodeo. Not whatever weird mixed tense hypothetical this is supposed to be. And I know that may seem like a little thing, but it just adds to that feeling of not knowing what he's talking about, but trying to preach to us his gospel anyway. That is to say, this comic probably should have been named Mansplainer and not Preacher. There's also a crazy amount of what feels like filler to this comic. There's so many issues that feel like they're just there to help this comic reach their goal of issue 66. In fact, the most recent collection ends on volume 6, issue 66. Hilarious. But, despite all its faults, I can't help but enjoy this comic. The story is surprisingly compelling, and if you can look past all the blatant attempts to offend you in every possible way, and the massive amount of what adds up to some serious mansplaining, the story is surprisingly interesting, and there's something about it that feels almost depressingly soul-bearing, that makes it hard to put down, even at its worst. So all that is why I'm giving this series a recommendation level of high. Whatever its faults, it's still one of the most significant comics of its time, and one of the few comics I've actually enjoyed that have been called such. Thanks everybody for watching. I'm sorry about the length of this video, but there's so much to this comic worth talking about, and I still left out a bunch. For example, I didn't even mention the specials and one-shots, and I'm hoping to do a separate video just to talk about those. It won't be nearly this long, I promise. But that's for another time. Next week, I'm starting a new thing, and if you want to find out what that is, be sure to stick around. Hope to see you then, right here in the Comic Cave.